Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next in our series of Breakbulk webinars. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Liz, and I'm a senior content producer here at Breakbulk and look after our live and now ever more digital content across our Europe and Middle Eastern shows. So this week we have a very special edition as we are all meant to be together in Bremen celebrating Breakbulk Europe. So we hope that this webinar will provide insightful, and it's a fantastic way for us all to connect as we are unable to meet at our events at the moment. So I will shortly be handing over to our lovely panel of Breakbulk industry experts who will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on their business, as well as the opportunities and positive developments that they see coming over the coming months. Before I do, I just wanted to go through a couple of functionality points about how to engage with our speakers and also our other audience members during the session. So firstly, to mention, this webinar will be available on demand straight after the session, and it will also be linked as a YouTube link on our website within 24 hours. So the session will run for around 45 minutes, and then the panelists will leave 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So you'll see that you have a panel either on the right-hand side, or for some of you it may be below the screen, that has various tabs along the top. So if you have a question that you would like our panelists to answer, then please use the question function and we will get to those questions at the end. There's also a voting function for the questions. So if you see a question that you also would like answered, you can use the upvote button, which means that we can prioritise those questions with the most votes at the very end. So the chat function, I can hear it going already, will also remain open for everybody to use throughout the session. Please feel free to use that for any additional comments that you have. It's always fantastic to see where people are tuning in from. However, do note that the questions we take will only be taken from the questions tab. We will also be activating a couple of polls at the beginning and towards the end of the webinar. When a poll is activated, a little red dot will appear on the polls tab. So please do, we encourage you to get involved when we send these out. It's always fantastic for us to see your feedback, and it helps us to ensure that the webinars that we provide are really of the highest quality and relevant content for you. I'm actually just going to set the first poll live now. So if you can let me know if you can see this. So hopefully you'll see the first poll live now, and if you can all respond to that, we can get an idea of who is listening in today. And finally, I've left my email address at the very top of the chat box. So if you have any additional feedback or anything you'd like to mention, please feel free to email me with any additional comments. So I would now like to hand over to our moderator for this session, Jürgen Osmers. Jürgen is a great friend of Breakbulk, an industry expert and a former owner of KOG Transport. Jürgen is joining us all the way from Florida this afternoon. So Jürgen, over to you.
Good day. I'm happy to welcome you to this first Breakbulk view from the Boardroom panel discussion. Under normal circumstances, as Liz said, we would be in Bremen now and have this discussion live. We hope that we will be able to do it as lively as we would have in Bremen. Therefore, please feel free to send in your questions on the question panel. When you do, kindly state, besides your name, your association, so that we know, just as we did always at the Breakbulk conferences, your name as well as the body you are representing. I'm happy to have the following panelists with us. James Hookham, Secretary General, Global Shippers Forum. Cyril Varghese, Global Logistics Director, Strategy and Commercial, Fluor Corporation. Marco Peusler, Chief Operating Officer in Global Energy and Capital Projects, UTC Overseas. And Ulrich Ulrichs, Chief Executive Officer, BBC Chartering. Before turning this over to the panelists for their detailed introduction, I would like to point out that the views and ideas which we are presenting here are new to everybody. We haven't been in this situation before. Nobody has been here before. And we all have to see which path we are going for the future together. So therefore, the panelists will not be able to comment on any company internal matters. And I would appreciate if you would not ask any questions referring to any company internal details. With this, I would like to ask James to start with the introduction, followed by Cyril, followed by Marco, and then Ulrich.
Thank you, Jürgen, and hello to everybody. My name is James Hookham. I am the Secretary General of the Global Shippers Forum. GSF is the voice of shippers and cargo owners with the international regulatory agencies, and is the champion of the cargo owners' interests in the international logistics market. We represent over 25 national shippers associations from all around the world, represented in each continent. And of course, it has been the cargo owners' pandemic and crisis just as much as it has been those that they rely on to transport their goods. I will make a few brief introductory comments to let you know how GSF perceives markets reacting to the crisis, and we'll be happy to address any particular points in the questions that you give in the way that Jürgen and Liz have described. So we're in a unique situation. We can talk at length about how individual businesses have reacted to the situation, but I think the consensus amongst a lot of shippers is to look to the future. So I will spend a few minutes just outlining some of the factors that we think will be vital in assessing the shape of future markets, the levels of demand, and the kinds of service that shippers will be looking for from logistics providers in the future once we are through this immediate crisis. And of course, what we've witnessed is a massive hit on consumer confidence and an ability to spend. And it's not just buying patterns that have been affected, but also the spending power of consumers. Both of those are going to return in different ways and at different time scales. And clearly the demands that generates, especially in North America and European markets, will largely dictate the demand for container shipping services and indeed air cargo services to meet that. So it's very unpredictable exactly how quickly that will come back and what the aggregate spending power of economies will be. But I think we'll be looking a little bit more about the economics in a little moment. Just wanted to mention a few other factors that certainly have been on our radar over recent months before the pandemic hit and haven't gone away and will continue, I believe, to dominate and certainly influence the way that global logistics markets do recover from COVID-19. Don't forget, we're still in the middle of a trade war. The US-China tariff war continues. And although there have been high points, there have definitely been low points. It hasn't gone away. And there is a belief, of course, that the experiences of the pandemic will lead to greater degrees of protectionism in certain countries. And we've seen the souring of trade relations between major economies, between China and Australia, only this week. So that will have a clear impact on the rate of recovery and the rate of recovery of demand for logistics services and the shape in which that returns. Another factor which again has improved but certainly not gone away is the issue of climate change. And both the global shipping and indeed the global aviation sectors were under and remain under immense pressure to develop realistic and achievable reduction targets in greenhouse gas emissions. One of the casualties of the pandemic was a cancellation of a key meeting of the International Maritime Organization in London last month, at which there was a huge amount of expectation that greenhouse gas reduction targets for the global shipping sector were at least going to be discussed and start to be agreed, if not actually finalized. That's only been postponed, it hasn't been cancelled. And so that will be something that the world will need to return to and governments will return to once normal business has been resumed in the international agencies. Meanwhile, back home amongst cargo owners, I cannot believe there won't be a serious review of sourcing policy and some major exercises conducted by the major buyers of goods and commodities around the world about de-risking their whole supply chains, given the way that in the early part of the crisis, the very high degree of reliance on China did catch a lot of buyers of cargo and buyers of goods out and unawares. And we will no doubt see a diversification of sourcing policy as buyers return to the market, as indeed we started to see simply by virtue of attempts to resource stock away from China and away from suppliers that were affected by tariffs and other trade sanctions. So Jürgen, that's my summary of the way that we're seeing it, certainly from the boardroom of the Global Shippers Forum at the moment. So I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Cyril, please go ahead.
Based out of Dubai. First of all, let me thank the Breakbulk for organizing this webinar on the day where, ironically, if everything were to be normal, many of us would have been making plans for an eventful evening at the Bremen Marktplatz. And I'm happy to see so many familiar names among the attendees. So over the last few months, the supply chain and logistics, two pretty much extremely underappreciated streams where all of us belong, have been thrust into the limelight along with medical professionals in the front-end fight against COVID-19. Let me place and record our appreciation for the medical professionals, administrators, as well as people from our own community who, behind the scenes, work overtime to source and transport goods all across the globe. Our colleagues and employers, families and friends, stakeholders in the industry can all take an extra dose of help from each other to strengthen each other in time of crisis. So in Fluor, we continue focusing on our first priority of being safer together, trying to stay safe along with families, colleagues, communities, partners, and other stakeholders. We're also utilizing this time to accelerate many initiatives, mostly centered around waste reduction and cost optimization. I've been having multiple conversations with industry colleagues ever since the travel restrictions started kicking in. And I found it absolutely insightful and enjoyable to have these virtual meetings. As an industry, I believe we've adapted and we will continue to find workarounds for activities that we are constrained to do now and in the future. So during most of the conversations with freight forwarders, ship owners, heavy haulers and all, I hear concerns around regular and now very familiar conversations from owners around preservation of cash, protection of balance sheets, so on and so forth. I guess there is genuine concern in the industry about certain FIDs either moving to the right or having uncertainties associated with this. So we've, to name a few, Rovuma, Port Arthur, Texas LNG, Driftwood LNG, Rio Grande, Lake Charles LNG, Scarborough. These are all Tilenga. These are all projects where we've heard of the FID either moving to the right or the owners not taking an immediate decision about when FID can be expected. I guess overall these concerns are legitimate because the deferment of FIDs will certainly have an impact on our industry in terms of what cargo is out there for the market to perform. And we've seen many of the owners announcing capex reductions ranging from 20 to 40%, depending on which owner you talk about, which oil company you talk about. At the same time, I think it's also equally important to realize that there are extremely positive messages which are today available in the market if you care to look around. Some of the freight forwarders, when they speak to me, they talk about the positive aspects of the business, the new insights which they've received working from home, how they're supporting governments and hospitals fight the pandemic, finding new solutions to minimize supply chain disruptions. There are shipping lines taking delivery of newer, more fuel-efficient ships, heavy haulers who are getting into getting ready to expand in new territories on the back of confirmed order books, so on and so forth. So among the positive news, I would also want to share that the last couple of months we've heard positive vibes around projects like Shell and PetroChina, where going forward with the $6.3 billion Australian gas project in Queensland. We've seen commitments happen to heavy haulers on Arctic LNG. We've read last week FERC authorizing Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation for the $43 billion Alaska LNG project. We've heard Shell announcing FID for Train 7 of Nigeria LNG, Exxon breaking ground for a $10 billion petrochemical project in Guangzhou. Total, and Marco would probably weigh in on this later. Total recently announced that they intend to continue with their Mozambique LNG plans. And they also announced $15 billion financing, which they secured over the last, I guess, a week or so, of which around $4.3 billion came from US Exim Bank and $3 billion from Japanese Exim Bank. Qatar Petroleum made similar statements that despite their cost reductions of around 30% of capex reduction, they would still continue with the North Field expansion plans, and that would remain on track. Now, on the mining side, there have been promises based on some of the commodity movements which we've seen in the recent days. And I guess for us, it would be interesting to see how the price movements will improve confidence in terms of capital investments. For example, we saw the iron ore rallying last week, primarily on Brazil supply concerns and China uptake. We've seen gold on a steady increase since December. We've seen copper making modest positive movements of late. On renewables, we see generally a positive outlook. There also seems to be an additional interest in the carbon capture and storage projects, where we've seen some interesting investments in Norway and the US. Now, if you look at the Shanghai Container Freight Index, you look at the World Container Index, both of them have lost around 20% from the Jan to 2020 highs, but compared to the 2019 average values, they are still trending on a higher side. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there is still positivity. It's about where we find ourselves and where we can fit ourselves in terms of making a difference. So before I summarize and give it back to Jürgen, let me make few points. And we've all heard about the circle of control, circle of influence, and circle of concern. And I guess the key during these times would be to try and stop worrying about our circle of concern, which are events that you and I have no control over nor can influence. It is good to be prepared, but I don't think we should be losing sleep over something on which you and I have no control on. As an industry, the key would be to support each other during the crisis. Let's find time to talk to each other, to mentor each other, and to also make sure that we reach out to each other and find ways to share burdens of colleagues and do whatever we can within our ability to make the crisis less painful. I guess at this point of time, and you may hear about this wherever you read, there is also a push for digitization, and it's a very logical one. I guess whatever we can do during this period to make the supply chains leaner and more agile, it would be upon us to make sure that we do so. Yeah, I thank you again for affording me this opportunity, and I'm now looking forward to hearing perspectives from my more learned and senior colleagues from the industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco, please.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you, Liz, for organizing, and thank you, fellow panelists. I wish a good afternoon to Europe and Africa, good evening to Asia. My name is Marco Cuellar. I am part of the executive management team of UTC Overseas, headquartered here in Houston. We've got 46 offices in 26 countries. We were, of course, very early on in China, involved with the COVID-19 response, with some of the hotspots, then later to Italy, and then in New York. And I have to say that we're very fortunate that our team is fine. And I'd like to wish to everybody on this call all the best for health and safety to all of you, your colleagues, and your family, number one. And that's been our priority, number one, with our colleagues. As we have these challenges, I have to say that from a headquarter point of view, I think we're, from UTC, having had our headquartered in New York, actually not far from your office there, Jürgen, when you were downtown New York on 9/11. We quickly had to work remotely. In 2012, we had Hurricane Sandy up in the New York area when our headquarters was there. And then down here in Houston, when our headquarters moved down here, we had Hurricane Harvey in 2017. I think my point is we've dealt with business continuity issues, and we've survived thanks to good IT people that we've had, and it's worked, and we've been able to support our clients, fortunately, and continue that. And of course, be sensitive to what our offices need around the world. I'm very proud that our industry is considered an essential worker. And of course, we thank the first responders, but often overlooked are the truck drivers and the terminal operators that are keeping our cargo moving. I mean, and I say that one of the biggest challenges we've had loading ships around the world is not being able to travel. Besides not being able to go to Breakbulk and conferences and engage and have great drinks with our clients, not being able to go there and making it work. That's been a challenge we've been able to overcome. So that's my short introduction. Thank you, Jürgen.
Thank you very much, Marco. I now would like to ask Ulrich to give a brief introduction. Ulrich, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jürgen. Yeah, I'm Ulrich Ulrichs. I'm CEO of BBC Chartering, arguably the biggest breakbulk project operator in the world. We run about 140 ships worldwide. And because of our coverage worldwide, also our 30-odd offices we have worldwide, we, of course, had quite a bit of exposure to the current situation, COVID-19 at the beginning, also the weeks after, and what we have now and going into the future. And I'm looking forward to share some of the experience we have made all around the world, some of the measures we have taken in the various areas, in how we see the things going forward, economy going forward, and how we believe things will turn out the coming months from the carrier's perspective. So I'm happy to share some of our experience, views, and so on with you. But first of all, just like to thank you to Breakbulk to set this up. It's quite interesting. I think it's a good opportunity for us to share some of our thoughts. And I like to thank on this stage also my colleagues and our business partners worldwide for handling the situation in the last few months and weeks, and also battling on every day and to help us to manage the situation. It's very difficult, I know. And same goes for our service providers and a lot of our clients, of course, as well. So that's also a thanks from my side. And I come to that later to a point also what I believe is important, at least from a carrier's perspective, probably a lot of other industry-related companies, what is important to battle the situation out and survive and then have a better future. Thanks, Jürgen.
Thank you very much, Rory. Let me start with a couple of questions, and I think one almost every listener is interested in, addressed to James. James, what advice is the Global Shippers Forum providing to its members about the procurement of logistics services in the post-COVID market? I'm sorry, you need to turn on your mic.
Okay, so we have our first priority as the crisis started to break was to assist our national shipper associations to address the points that Ulrich was just making, and that was to make sure that the continued free movement of trade and movement of particularly essential supplies was recognized by national governments as an essential activity in their economies. I think that one of the good takeaways perhaps from this crisis, few as there are, is that again governments have come to realize just how essential supply chain logistics is to the proper functioning of their economies and to their societies. And part of the advice that the GSF was giving in the early weeks was to help national associations make those representations to government to get essential status for workers, to get critical infrastructure protected and to allow it to continue functioning, and to get some obvious remedies to cash flow addressed, such as deferment of customs duties and things like that. As we're coming out of the crisis and different countries are at different points on this curve, I think the advice that is most important at the moment is to make sure that you are testing and challenging some of the prices that you're being quoted. We started this conference by talking about it being a unique situation. No one really knows the background against which they are quoting and the costs at which they're quoting against. So there does need to be a good discussion between buyer of logistics services and provider to make sure a fair and transparent price is being offered. And the third piece of advice is for the longer term is that one of the opportunities that this crisis presents is a real chance to go back into your supply chains and your processes and start to take costs out. And digitization of all that paperwork is a great place to start. Physical exchange of paperwork is something that's been something we should be avoiding during the crisis anyway, because of the risk of contamination. But in the longer term, now is a great opportunity to start really tackling that digitization opportunity and removing costs from your supply chain. Jürgen.
Thank you very much. I would like to hear from Marco how he sees it as a logistics provider, the impact of COVID-19. But before he answers the question, he would like to present a couple of slides outlining how the COVID-19 has affected the market. Marco.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you, Jürgen. I pulled some slides together from various sources here that paint the picture. I think we, by intuition and by hardcore experience, have seen these graphs, but maybe they help paint the picture clearly what we're experiencing. This slide here shows the impact, the COVID impact on the currencies this year. As you can see, the tremendous devaluation of various currencies, the Brazilian real, 23%, South African rand, 32%. This is important. These countries obviously are important areas of the world for purchasing industrial goods, and most importantly for the breakbulk audience, shipping contracts are typically done in US dollars or possibly euros, and this is suddenly a lot higher in terms of cost. You may say, okay, this may be better for the exports, but right now the demand is just not there. The global impact on the GDP, this slide here shows absolutely global and across the board. The projection from the OECD is a worldwide reduction in 1.5%. The red is North America, the blue is China. If you can see the screen, green is Europe. So across the and specifically Asia, which often many call the workshop of the world. If you look at the chart here compared to other crises, the old crisis shock of 1973, the Asian financial crisis of 1998, there was still growth in Asia. Here we've hit zero. This is how dramatic this is. My final slide here to talk about with specifically on China. This compares the COVID impact versus SARS, which happened in 2002. If you look at the scale of the involvement of China in the world economy today, the lighter orange is 2019 and the blue is 2002 during the SARS epidemic. So we see the global GDP of China in 2019 being about 18%. And 8% in 2002. Global trade, 12% in 2019, and about 4% in 2002. But the most interesting here for cargo, what does this mean for cargo? China is one of the most important commodity imports, and some of the importance of the projects that Cyril was referring to in mining is an example. If we look at 75% of the aluminum, 60% of the copper. We know how important copper are for countries like Chile. nickel, zinc, these are here. And if I may say, with LNG and some of the LNG projects that also Cyril referred to, China had a 5-year plan to get decarbonized, get off the coal. And a lot of that was the offtake agreements for a lot of these LNG plants. That was an important thing. So China in the first quarter had a reduction of 6%. Last week, the Chinese in their important meetings are not declaring their GDP this year. So this is a bit of bad news for us, and we really hope that the political rhetoric can all be overcome, because we know how important China is, not only just for what we tip consumer goods manufacturing, but for project cargo, making sure that the price levels are there for commodities that the investors say go forward on an LNG plant or a copper plant and so forth. On the currency, besides the currency in terms of the areas, we also are watching even in the European community. Of course, with Brexit, the European Union has been survived for 60 years. It still looks strong. But last week in the German Constitutional Court overruled the ECB ruling of bond sales with the Karlsruhe. That is something to watch, because this is not politicians. This is actually the Constitutional Court concerned about the role of the ECB. So these are all uncertainties that we have to deal with. I should still say that on the positive end, government spending is something we have to watch. The OECD, if we look at, which represents 37 countries, 67% of the world's GDP, are expected to pump in this year, $17 trillion. We hope that once the vaccine is around, that money eventually gets to move some cargo. Something to watch is a lot of this green stimulus. Some of the projects that Cyril also referred to in terms of renewable, how much of that money is going to go to hydrogen plants and set-asides, and even here in the US, the discussion about allocating that. So that is something in terms of following the money and seeing where that is going to be allocated, because right now, it's following government money is really critical.
Thank you very much, Marco. Nice introduction. How will a project freight forwarder help their clients select vessels within this market?
These days, it's even more a challenge in terms of it's great to have BBC on with their global network and their great reputation. Obviously, the challenge becomes a lot of the regional players. One of the things that's a novel is to watch bunker fuels and bunker credits. There's a lot of, even though the money is cheap these days, a lot of the bunker companies are tightening up on credit. So that's something unique, besides the usual of following the P&I clubs and so forth. So that's something we're paying attention to as well in vetting carriers. That's a novelty.
Great, thank you very much. Ulrich, in which areas was BBC affected the most by COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks, Jürgen. Yeah, as I said before, we are active globally. So with our APEX service, any port, any cargo, we had all kinds of issues all over the world. Of course, it started first in China, Asia, later affected other regions as well. So we try to identify what's going on when it all started, try to see what lessons we can learn and apply that to other regions. Initially, of course, our main concern was for our staff and people. So we put some measures and processes, procedures in place with regards to health and safety to make sure everybody is okay, and also to make sure that we are technically able to work from home and have all the IT structure and so on, hardware, software in place so that we can keep communicating. Overall, that actually went surprisingly well, I have to say. Globally, we had no major issues there. The main issues we really had was delays with regards to cargo readiness. In a lot of places, it started first in China, but then expanded to also India, South America, Europe, and so on. So cargo readiness was definitely a big problem. And also the decision delays. A lot of our clients could not make any decisions because they couldn't reach either their partners, they couldn't reach their customers, or they were uncertain about the situation either at the load port or at the destination of the cargo. What does it help if I have a cargo ready now? I load it, but once the ship gets to the destination, maybe I have a problem, maybe a port will be closed. So there were a lot of uncertainties there, and a lot of clients simply could not make any decisions. So we had to deal with that. And as it was also mentioned before, travel actually also was an issue, especially for our port captains and people attending the vessels. And I know a lot of our clients had the same issues, that they couldn't get their surveyors and their experts to the cargo, to the factories or the ports to make sure the cargo is okay before it's loaded. So that also had caused quite a few issues worldwide to make sure we have proper attendance. The other issues, not so much concerning maybe BBC chartering as a charterer of these vessels, but also thinking about the crew on board of the ships. A lot of the crew could not basically go on their leave, and they had to stay on board. We have a lot of European crew, but also Filipino crew and so on. When the ships were in the regions, of course, they could embark and we could replace the crew. But on some ships, they went to all kinds of places and didn't make it home. So that is something that we still have to pay attention to, that some of the crew on board, that they need to relieve. And I think it's not unique to BBC. It's in general as a shipping problem. We see that now in Europe is still cruise ships tied up in the ports here with crew on board that can't get home. So that were the main areas, the main issues we had to face since basically January, February. Jürgen?
That's great. You mentioned all the issues you faced. Now the million-dollar question: how did you overcome these issues?
Yeah, not so easy, but I think one really great asset we have, and I'm not so long with BBC yet, but I have to say it's really as a good team, as a good company, very well connected. And the key, from what I could observe the last few months, was really communication. Communication on all fronts, not only internally but also externally. I have to say also the communication with our clients and vendors was excellent. It was a very open and transparent and frequent communication to really be open and frank about what's going on, what are the issues, and try to then be flexible enough and be open enough and creative enough to tackle these issues. And I think communication was really a key from wherever people were, a lot on the phone, video conferences and so on, but communication with the client was a key, and internally as well, so we can swiftly react. We had, I can give you a couple of examples where cargo sourcing suddenly changed from China to South America. So, okay, we have this cargo, we need this cargo, but now the production is in South America, not in China anymore. What can you do? And then you need to be flexible and you need to be fast to react to these challenges. And I have to say, the communication with the clients, also with service providers, agents, was actually quite good, because I felt it was quite open. Nobody could see this situation coming. Everybody was surprised, and you felt a little bit, we're all in the same boat, we're all affected. Let's find a solution that everybody can live with. So I think communication and an open mind and flexibility were the key answers to these challenges in the last few weeks. Jürgen?
Thank you very much, Rorik. As we are getting tight here on time, maybe just a brief answer from James. Looking forward, what opportunities and positive developments do you see emerging here?
Thank you, Jürgen. I think there are good evidence, and some of our other panelists have referred to this. Ulrich was mentioning this just now, of some great teamwork and unexpected cooperation between supply chain partners, which has helped goods to get to destination that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have got there quite as quickly. I've certainly been impressed by the degree to which the carriers have to us mostly attempted to communicate their situation to the market. It was a little slow, and I spent most of the month of February attempting to establish a reliable database of blanked sailings and which airlines actually were serving Chinese destinations. But the sort of networks that were established both by organizations like mine, but also by businesses as well, I think will endure. And there are some positive signs of those new relationships being established. I think we've also learnt, and this will endure too, we've also learnt not to accept the status quo and to really test some of the old assumptions and some of the old mantras in the market. I think it's going to be a very different type of market in the future. I hope that the spirit of cooperation and the spirit of can-do, which has certainly prevailed amongst many buyers of cargo services over the past few months, will endure, because I think we're going to have some pretty tough problems to solve going forward. I think that there are a lot of opportunities, but we're certainly not out of the woods yet.
Great, thank you very much, James. I would like to go to a couple of questions now from our audience, because there are some good questions coming in here. And this first one, I would like to address to Marco and to Ulrich. Of course, James, feel free. Cyril unfortunately dropped off at the moment. We hope to get him back soon. Marco, the question comes in here from Lars Greiner from Hamburg Port Consulting. What do you see as the key takeaways as to how the market will change in the long term as a direct outcome of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of cargo and vessel flows? And I think this is something maybe for Marco and for Ulrich to answer. Marco, please.
Sure. Just to expand a little bit about my introduction there with the slides, where we see we're obviously in a very disruptive market here globally in the economies of every country. And what that means is it's government spending, and that $17 trillion is what to watch. And as I just yesterday, there was quite a bit in the press about the fact that the hydrogen plants are something to watch, that in Europe, that may be the way to decarbonize. And that may rise new industries and new capital project investments. At the same time, the IEA announced that they expect that oil prices will actually be higher than before the pandemic. We see in Beijing and Shanghai, individuals are wanting to drive in a car. They don't want to take public transportation. We've seen that when Germany was opening up as well. What is that going to mean for electric cars or gasoline cars? So all of these, we've got a couple of weeks and months to figure out where investors are going to save and put their money. But I think that the one to watch the money on is exactly to what extent these stimulus become green stimulus, and because that will actually also be new industries and also new and exciting project cargo for us.
Yeah, and
thank you very much.
From my side, I think the key, first of all, understanding we need to have, at least we have that, is that we're in for marathon as far as that crisis is concerned. It will not be a sprint to recovery. It will not happen tomorrow, and it will not, let's say, recover overnight. So we have to really prepare for a long drain. We have to prepare for a slow recovery. But I also believe that the recovery will come eventually, that oil price will also increase, that also investments will increase, government spending will definitely increase. So I think I do not believe that globalization will stop overnight. It will still be a global market, and there's still needs for transportation and for shipping. Maybe in certain areas or for certain type of commodities, I rather think consumer goods and so on, there might be a change. But as far as the cargoes we carry, I don't expect a long-term change. It's only that we have to prepare for quite a period to see that things going back to normal. So that is really something we have to be mentally, I think, prepare for, like everybody experience in their day-to-day life. You have certain restrictions which will disappear, but it's not back to normal yet. And I think that situation will be in the transportation side as well. So it will still take some time, but it will eventually recover. And of course, you have to, your mentality has to adjust to that time frame. Jürgen?
Thank you very much, Ulrich. A question, I think this is best directed to James from Leandro. Considering all the problems we have faced and the discussions about China dependency, further to the current trade way lasting for about a year now, don't you see a chance on the global supply chain moving to a more leaner and even regional supply chain?
Thanks, Jürgen. Yes, I mentioned this a little earlier. I certainly have seen that reported in a number of markets. And this was a process that was underway, certainly as regards businesses sourcing from China, because they were seeking to reduce their exposure to increasing tariffs. They were encouraging manufacturers and seeking new supplies of sources from outside China. And I think Vietnam in particular was benefiting from that trend. And that was only catalyzed and accelerated in the early weeks of the pandemic, as some of those projects were accelerated and factories opened up even quicker, just to keep supplies moving and producing, when obviously nothing much was happening in China itself. I think a lot of cargo buyers, a lot of importers have found that they are very exposed, very vulnerable. Certainly the geopolitical situation should have been enough to perhaps suggest some vulnerability and risk there. But as we've mentioned, we're not out of the crisis yet, of this pandemic crisis. And who's to say that there won't be a COVID-20 or COVID-21, never mind a COVID-19. So I am sure that there will be a review of sourcing, particularly of consumer goods, and an attempt to make supply chains less dependent on particular national circumstances. If that hasn't already started, my advice to shippers at the moment would be, now's a good time to start.
Great, thank you very much, James. Marco, a question is coming here from Andreas Walter in regards to the US Exim Bank. We all know how active UTC and you personally were in fighting for the reinstatement of the financing. And this is not only important for the US exporters, it's likewise important for the receivers of the cargo. And the question which comes up here, do you see the on Exim Bank, or do you believe that more breakbulk cargo will be financed and supported by the US Exim Bank? And Andreas is particularly interested when you see the start of the Mozambique LNG project.
Yeah, great question here in the context of COVID here. Let me just say I have to thank Breakbulk Media for covering this for the past 5 years. And I have to thank a lot of our colleagues in the industry, such as the ECMC, in going through and being diligent and doing all the work we had to do to get that. But also the ownership of UTC. The Posthumus family was personally involved, and we don't do lobbying, but this was an important issue for the industry. And let me emphasize globally. If we look at just Mozambique as an example, that has the world's largest gas fund 7 years ago, and it was work on getting project finance together. But the recent press there on Total that Cyril had mentioned, you're looking at a $25 billion project. $5 billion is U.S. Exim, the largest ever in the Exim history. By the fact that U.S. Exim is on the table, that brings other banks, other financing mechanisms, and it's not just Exim Bank. We've got the Japanese, the Koreans, a lot of the countries have their form of project finance on export credit agencies. So the fact that Exim Bank is back finally for 7 years, and I have to thank also Bill Schubert. He personally was involved on a lot of effort to get this done. The fact that we have this ECA back for 7 years is good, not necessarily that it has to become US flag or even from the United States, just the fact that we have that project finance has a resource. This will affect the entire world as a destination and also as a resource for finance. So it's actually tremendous good news for us when we all want to hear good news that we have this.
Thank you very much. Great. And thank you really for all your efforts there. The next question, I think, is best directed to Ulrich, and it's something everybody would like to have the right crystal ball for. A question coming from Ashish Shade. How do you see the freight levels moving in the near and long term for the breakbulk cargo?
Well, nice question. From the carrier's perspective, of course, I have to say freight rates will go through the roof. But seriously, I think the freight rates, of course, have reduced the last few months a bit, but also relates to cost. So, of course, if oil price is low, bunker is low, then it has an impact on the pricing. I think this will stabilize. We see the oil price, bunker price going up a little bit now. Of course, now talking about COVID-19, we forgot about the issue we had earlier this year, and actually was much talked about at the last Breakbulk in Dubai, is also the IMO 2020 regulations. I mean, this topic will come back on the agenda. Low sulfur fuel will be more expensive than high sulfur fuel. And of course, that's something that will sooner or later be on the agenda. So their cost will go up. So that's why also freight rates need to increase along the cost side. But I believe also in general, I mean, the shipping industry in general, also this particular segment has not been particularly healthy the last few years. So now in order to make sure we still can provide a service in the future, the ship owners and also the carriers, they need to invest in new tonnage. I believe there's still a lot of old ships out there. There's a lot of potential for scrapping. That has been a little bit delayed because of COVID-19. Bunker price goes down. Some of the old and thirsty ships maybe can still be around in this market. But as soon as these bunker prices go up, some of the tonnage will disappear. And actually, in general, I believe in the MPP heavy lift segment, we'll have a shortage of ships. And then have to see who is able to invest again in new tonnage and who has the money or financial means to invest. And for that, you also need to provide a margin to these investors or to your shareholders in order to justify this investment. So it's not so easy, but I think freight rates will come up, not suddenly, but slowly and surely, and they have to come up in order to make a margin that justifies investment in the future. And it's not something that's happening next year or in a couple of years, but if you look at the age structure of the NDP fleet, in 2024, 25, a lot of ships will go for scrapping, and then you really have a shortage of vessels. So actually, you need to order something the next couple of years in order to still have a service or have your market share covered in the next 4 or 5 years and thereafter. So I don't think it will explode overnight, but carriers will push. They will push for rates going up. And the more oil price goes up, the faster the freight rates will go up as well.
Good. Thank you very much. So the same as the last 25 years, right?
Yeah. No, let's say since 2008.
Okay. James, the next one, I think, comes here to you from Thomas Damsgaard. How have you identified new essential value chain partners during COVID-19, and do you see closer collaboration going forward? where are the opportunities?
Yeah, great question. As I was saying earlier, I think those partnerships or those relationships have begun to form out of necessity in order to manage the crisis, and I'm hoping that that these new understandings, these new skills, will continue and will enrich the knowledge and the experiences of shippers in managing supply chains. And will address some of the issues that we've just been talking about, because for every ship charterer or ship owner that is keeping their fingers crossed that rates are going to go up, believe me, there's a whole community of cargo owners and shippers that will be wanting to negotiate with you about managing those rates down, or at least keeping them where they are. And that is going to come through efficiencies and savings. The Global Shippers Forum is very realistic about the cost pressures that are on the industry, and certainly takes no issue with the need to address sulfur emissions and air quality, and is taking a very pragmatic position in the discussions about greenhouse gas emissions. But I think we do need some transparency and some better understanding and visibility about what these costs are. Shipping lines, carriers need to employ better skills and partners to help manage those costs and understand where the savings are, just as cargo buyers need to find new ways of moving cargo more efficiently in order to keep those costs down. I think it's going to be a very interesting few years as we play out of this crisis, and not only factor in all of the crisis management issues we've been talking about, but some of these other bigger plays on climate change, changing consumer patterns as well. I will come back to my earlier point that I see a lot of scope for immediate savings in working with partners, just simply to take the costs out of supply chains by removing the paperwork. That's as much a comment on the maritime industry as it is on the aviation sector as well. There's still too much paperwork in aviation, never mind in shipping.
James, maybe also as a good follow-up here for you to answer. It's a question from Colin on the financial and service capacity. Will project owners do a reassessment of their partners to ensure they have emerged successfully out of this pandemic and that they can perform as before? What do you hear from your colleagues?
I'm not certain I can answer that question in a useful way at this stage, partly because I think things are still so fluid. I think that there will need to be much more intensive reviews of sourcing and supply policy by some of the major consumer goods movers and buyers around the world. But look, in the UK, where I'm speaking from, the government's only just announced the reopening of shops from the week after next. So there'll still be a restocking crisis for many retailers to get through before they sit down and really start to think through again their sourcing and supply chain policy. That will take place obviously in the context of renegotiation of shipping contracts, which are most of them only a few weeks old anyway. So I think this will take a little time to play out. And I would imagine, and I would certainly advise most shippers to make sure that we have got into slightly calmer waters, and they have a little bit more time and management bandwidth to address this properly, rather than trying to do it on the fly as part of the crisis management response. These are really big issues. These are really serious issues. They need some committed management and often need quite a lot of working capital to get them up and running. So don't rush into this. Get through the crisis, and then with your partners, try to take this on in a much more project management way, rather than just a quick fix for the crisis.
Thank you very much, James. One very interesting question is coming in here from Ashish, directed to Ulrich. A lot of cargo is moving from breakbulk to containerization. And in order to reduce the cost of logistics, how do you see the future of the breakbulk volumes reducing and the containerized cargo increasing? Also, the mainline carriers have ventured in beating many breakbulk carriers. How do you plan to address this?
Yeah, thanks. Also a good question. I mean, it's not new now. It's not COVID-19 related. This issue has been with us for the last few years. We see a lot of container carriers having as one of their main strategies and key targets as far as cargo is concerned. So on one side, I believe that the market is a little bit shrinking as far as breakbulk project cargo is concerned for this specialized sector. On the other side, I also believe that the overall fleet is shrinking. We will have less tonnage overall and less vessels, and we have seen a decrease already in last few years. Minor, but I think this will let's say get even worse as far as tonnage is concerned, because a lot of the ships will turn 20 years or older in the coming years. For some of these cargoes, it's not appropriate anymore, and there's very little new building activity in this segment. You see some bigger ships, yes, but they're not really for some of the markets we serve and some of the cargoes we carry. And of course, we need to address it by being also more efficient and being more focused on cost optimization. But I believe, despite attacks from the container boys, not to forget also the bulk carriers and also ro-ro carriers. I mean, they're also very active. We need to be a little bit faster, smarter, and more flexible and also efficient to beat these guys. We'll not make it all the time, but I think there's still enough cargo out there in the long term that breakbulk carriers, project carriers can make a living. But I believe long term also you will see less ships and also less players in the market, and that will also be helpful for our segment. It's still, let's say, part of the consolidation we've seen in the container industry hasn't quite reached breakbulk heavy lift segment yet.
Thank you very much, Rory. And I see Liz is coming on. That means our time is up, unfortunately. I think we could go on. There are many interesting questions here. We could go on for another hour or two. But Liz, please.
Exactly, we could indeed. I just wanted to thank you all so much, to our panelists and also for our moderator, and also to mention that Cyril sends his apologies. Unfortunately, his connection dropped and he wasn't able to join us. However, we will try and get him on at one of our webinars very shortly, whether it be next week or over the coming months. So thank you again for such a great session this afternoon, and also thank you to everybody for your fantastic engagement with the questions. What we will try and do, as there were so many fantastic questions, is share these with the panelists after the session and see whether they might be able to give us their responses, and we can share that with you via our newsletter so you can all receive answers to your questions. Again, note that this webinar will be available on demand on our website within 24 hours if you'd like to view it again. And also, before you head off, I have activated the final poll questions, so if you could kindly take a moment just to complete those before you leave, that would be really appreciated. And then finally, at 4 p.m. British time tomorrow, we have the second of our Breakbulk 1 shows, which will be our Women in Breakbulk Europe edition on the topic of crisis leadership. So my colleague Kat will post the link with how to register for that just now in the chat, and please do keep an eye on our website for information on our other upcoming webinars. So with that, thank you so much to all of our fantastic panelists today, and thank you to everybody, and we hope to see you again very, very soon.
Thank you, Liz.
All.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you all. Stay healthy. Thanks to the audience. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.